In the frozen sewers of Chicago, 1964, sanitation workers found something that would scare them forever. A perfectly kept body, hurt with an ice pick and frozen solid in the winter ice. But this was not just another gang killing in a city that had seen thousands. This was the work of a man the FBI would later call the worst torture killer in American history. A man so crazy that even the most dangerous gangsters in the Chicago outfit were afraid of him. A man who wore pajamas to court, carried an ice pick in his pocket like other men carried pens, and built a quiet room for hurting people under his family home where his wife and children slept upstairs, never knowing the screams that echoed below. This is the story of Sam DeStefano, and before we are done, you will understand why even the mob itself, a group built on violence and fear, had to put him down like a sick dog. But before we go down into the basement of madness, I need to know, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. Are you listening alone in the dark with headphones on at 3 a.m.? Tell me your story, and if you are ready for the most upsetting tale in Chicago outfit history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you will not want to miss what comes next. Give this video a like if you are brave enough to hear the whole story. Now let us begin. To understand the monster that Sam DeStefano would become, we must first understand the world that shaped him. On September 13, 1909, in the small Illinois town of Streator, a boy was born to Samuel DeStefano Sr. and Rosalie Brasco. They were Italian immigrants, part of the big wave of Southern European people moving to America that changed American cities at the start of the 1900s. They had arrived on American shores in 1903, carrying the dreams that millions of immigrants carried. Dreams of wealth, safety, and a chance in the new world. Samuel Sr. was a coal miner, one of thousands of Italian immigrants who went down into the dark, dangerous mines of Illinois to get the black fuel that powered America's Industrial Revolution. It was hard work, back-breaking, choking, and deadly cave-ins, gas explosions, and black lung disease killed miners often. But Samuel Sr. worked hard, saved what he could, and finally managed to move out of the mines into slightly better work as a grocer and later a real estate salesman. He was living the American dream in his own way, building a life for his growing family. The DeStefanos eventually had 7 children. 3 sons and 4 daughters. Sam was the middle child in many ways. Neither the oldest son, who would get the responsibility, nor the youngest, who would get the most attention. The family life was normal for working-class Italian immigrant families of the time. Strict Catholic values, close family ties, a focus on respect and hard work, and an expectation that the children would do better than their parents. But young Sam DeStefano was different from his brothers and sisters from an early age. There was something in his eyes, something in his attitude that made him stand apart. While the exact details of his childhood are lost to history, we know that whatever happened in those early years planted seeds that would grow into something dark and twisted. The family spent Sam's early years in Huron, Illinois, a coal mining town in Williamson County, and those years would prove important in ways the family could never have guessed. Huron in the early 1920s was a powder keg of worker tension. The coal mines were the economic heart of the region, and the relationship between mine owners and miners was full of mutual distrust, sometimes violence and deep-seated anger. This tension exploded into bloodshed in June 1922, in an event that would become known as the Huron Massacre. During a violent worker fight, a mob of Union coal miners and their supporters attacked people breaking the strike and mine guards, killing 19 men. Some were shot trying to run away. Others were beaten to death. A few were hanged from trees. It was a shocking show of group violence, and while young Sam was only 12 or 13 years old at the time, growing up after such brutality would have left a mark. Violence, he learned, was how arguments were settled, violence was power. Shortly after the massacre and what happened after, the DeStefano family made a decision that would prove important. They moved to Chicago, specifically to the city's Little Italy neighborhood on the near west side, if they thought they were moving to a safer, more wealthy environment. They were sadly wrong. They had moved their family right into the heart of American organized crime. Chicago's Little Italy in the 1920s was ground zero for the criminal empire being built by Al Capone and the Chicago outfit. Prohibition had turned criminals into businessmen and businessmen into criminals. Bootlegging operations ran openly. Speakeasies operated on every block. Street gangs controlled areas with violence and fear. Political corruption was so common that honest cops were the exception, not the rule for a teenage boy like Sam DeStefano. The neighborhood offered a very different kind of education than his parents had meant. The real economy offered little to young Italian immigrants in the 1920s. Discrimination was open and common. No Italians need apply. Signs were posted at many businesses. The coal mines, the factories, the stockyards. These were the options for men like Sam's father. But on the streets, young Italian men saw a different path. They saw gangsters in expensive suits driving fancy cars. They saw men who commanded respect and fear. They saw power. Sam DeStefano was 17 years old when he took his first steps down the path that would define his life. On September 12, 1926, one day before his 17th birthday, he was arrested for the first time. The charge being a runaway from a jailbreak. The details of this first arrest are lost to history. But what matters is that it marked the beginning. Sam DeStefano now had a criminal record. And in the world he lived in, that was almost a badge of honor. What happened next showed something important about young Sam's personality. He had already developed a following, already commanded loyalty from other young criminals. On July 1, 1927, when Sam was arrested again, hundreds of West Side gang members rioted in response. Hundreds. This was not the reaction to the arrest of some random small-time criminal. This was the reaction to the arrest of someone who mattered. Someone who had already made himself a figure of importance in the neighborhood's criminal ranks. But Sam's early criminal career would soon take a much darker turn. One that showed the depths of his evil. In November 1927, Sam DeStefano and an associate named Ralph Orlando were arrested on charges that would shock even the tough police officers of Chicago. They were charged with kidnapping and rape of a 17-year-old girl. The details were horrible. But because of the sensitivities of the time and the victim's privacy, the full details were never made public in newspapers of the time. What we do know is scary enough. Vano and Orlando had taken the young woman with clear plan to attack her. According to the police report and later court testimony, the only reason the rape was not finished was because police arrived before DeStefano actually raped her. The language used in the court documents suggests that the attack was stopped at the last possible moment, that the young woman was saved only by the lucky timing of the police response. Any reasonable person would expect that kidnapping and attempted rape would result in a long prison sentence. But Sam DeStefano's sentence showed something important about Chicago's criminal justice system in the 1920s. It was completely corrupt, easily controlled, and basically unfair. Despite the seriousness of the charges, despite having a teenage victim, Vano was sentenced to only 3 years in prison. 3 years for kidnapping and attempted rape. Even more remarkably, he served less than the full sentence. Within a few years, DeStefano was back on the streets, free to continue his criminal career. For Sam, this experience taught a valuable lesson. The justice system was not a block to his criminal ambitions. It was just another problem that could be overcome with the right connections, the right bribes, or the right threats. Upon his release in 1930, DeStefano immediately went back to the criminal underworld of Chicago's West Side. And it was during this time that he joined what would prove to be one of the most important criminal organizations of his early life. The famous 42 Gang. The 42 Gang was legendary in Chicago's underworld. While Al Capone and the Chicago outfit were in the news, the 42 Gang was where the outfit found its future leaders. These were young men, teenagers, and men in their early 20s who were willing to do anything for money and status. They specialized in armed robbery, theft, attack, and sometimes murder. They were apprentice gangsters learning their job in the streets, proving themselves worthy of finally moving up into the outfit itself. The gang's name came from Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and they lived up to the comparison. They were thieves, certainly, but they were also cruel and people who did not care about others. Many historians of organized crime think the 42 Gang was one of the most violent youth gangs in American history. They did not just commit crimes, they enjoyed violence for its own sake. It was in the 42 Gang that Sam DeStefano met a young man who would become one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history. Sam Giancana, who would later become the boss of the Chicago outfit and have connections to CIA plans to kill Fidel Castro, was at this time just another ambitious young criminal. He and DeStefano became associates, though never close friends, even then. DeStefano's instability and cruelty made him difficult to fully trust or befriend. The 42 Gang served as a recruitment pool for the outfit. Al Capone and his replacements would watch these young men, judging their skills, their loyalty, their willingness to commit violence. The most promising would be brought into the outfit itself, given responsibilities and chances to prove themselves further. For most members of the 42 Gang, this was the final goal: to be made, to become a full member of the outfit, to have the protection and prestige that came with it. But for Sam DeStefano, that goal would always remain just out of reach. Even as he rose in the criminal ranks, even as he became rich through his loan sharking operations, even as he proved his willingness to commit murder, he would never be made. The outfit leadership would always think he was too unstable, too unpredictable, too dangerously insane to be fully trusted. But that was still years in the future. In 1930, DeStefano was just another young criminal learning his job. During this time, DeStefano became involved in bootlegging and gambling operations, the regular work of Prohibition-time organized crime. The money was good, but the work was dangerous. Turf wars between rival gangs were common. Police raids were a constant threat. Violence was part of daily life. In 1932, DeStefano took part in a grocery store robbery that went badly wrong. During the robbery, police arrived on the scene. Gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, DeStefano had been shot. He managed to escape, but his wounds needed medical help. He appeared at a hospital with unexplained bullet wounds, a story that was all too common in Chicago hospitals at the time. The doctors knew better than to ask too many questions. They treated him, and he disappeared back into the streets. But DeStefano's luck was about to run out, at least for a while. In 1933, he took part in a bank robbery in New Lisbon, Wisconsin. Bank robbery was a federal crime, and unlike Chicago's corrupt local police and courts, federal law enforcement was harder to bribe and scare. DeStefano was caught, tried, and found guilty. The sentence was severe: 40 years in federal prison for most criminals. A 40-year sentence at age 24 would effectively mean spending the rest of their life behind bars. But Sam DeStefano was not most criminals. His prison years would prove to be, in a twisted way, educational. He would meet the right people, learn valuable skills, and make connections that would shape his whole future criminal career. The time in prison would not break him, it would prepare him for the empire he would build. The American prison system in the 1930s was a complex world unto itself, especially for organized crime figures. While the public might have thought prison meant punishment and isolation, the reality was quite different for connected criminals. Prison was often a networking chance. a place where criminals from different cities and different organizations could meet, share knowledge, and form alliances. For Sam DeStefano, federal prison became something like a criminal university. He was sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, one of the most important federal prisons in the country. And at Leavenworth, DeStefano met men who would change his life. Among the inmates at Leavenworth during DeStefano's sentence were Paul the Waiter Rica and Louis Campagna, two of the most powerful figures in the Chicago outfit. Rica, in particular, was Chicago outfit royalty. He had risen through the ranks to become one of the most respected and influential mob bosses in America. By all accounts, Rica was everything DeStefano was not. Calm, calculated, smart, and reserved, where DeStefano was changeable and impulsive. Rica was patient and strategic, yet for some reason, Rica took a liking to the young, changeable Sam DeStefano. Perhaps Rica saw potential in DeStefano's willingness to commit violence. Perhaps he liked DeStefano's cleverness, which was big despite his mental instability. Or perhaps Rica simply saw that a man like DeStefano, properly directed, could be useful to the outfit. Whatever the reason, Rica began schooling DeStefano in a particular part of organized crime that would become the foundation of DeStefano's future empire. Juice loans, also known as loan sharking. The idea was simple but brutally effective. Loan sharks would lend money to people who could not get real loans. Gambling addicts, criminals, desperate businessmen, people with bad credit or no credit. The interest rates were very high, typically 20 to 25% per week. A loan of $100 would need payback of $125 after just 1 week. The mathematics of compound interest meant that these loans could quickly get out of control. Someone who borrowed $100 and could not make payments would owe $156 after just 2 weeks, $195 after 3 weeks within a month. A $100 loan could become a $200 debt. Within 2 months, it could become a $400 debt. And if the borrower could not pay, well, that is where violence came in. Rica explained to DeStefano the finer points of the business. How to find good customers, not people who could easily repay, but people who were desperate enough to accept the terms, but not so desperate that they had absolutely nothing. How to structure payments to make the most profit. How to use violence in a planned way, not too much. How to keep a reputation scary enough that most people who owed money would find a way to pay rather than face what would happen. But most importantly, Rica taught DeStefano about the other side of the loan sharking business. The corruption network that made it all possible. Loan sharking was illegal, of course. Laws against high interest rates in Illinois, as in most states, set maximum interest rates far below what loan sharks charged. But the law meant nothing if you had the police, prosecutors, and judges in your pocket. Rica explained how the Chicago outfit had spent years building a corruption network that went into every level of Chicago's government and criminal justice system. Local politicians were on the payroll. Judges could be bribed or scared. Police officers worked directly for the mob. This was not just a few corrupt people. This was built in. System-wide corruption that allowed organized crime to work almost openly for a man like DeStefano, who had already learned during his rape conviction that the justice system could be controlled. This was a revelation. The system was not just able to be corrupted. It was already corrupted completely and totally. All you needed was money and connections, and you could work with almost no punishment. DeStefano soaked up these lessons eagerly. He was a good student when the subject interested him. And this subject interested him very much. The juice loan business mixed everything he enjoyed: money, power, and chances for violence. It was perfect for him. But even as DeStefano was learning these valuable lessons, he was also working on getting out of prison early. His 40-year sentence might have seemed impossible to overcome. But in the corrupt system of 1930s and 1940s America, even federal sentences could be reduced with the right approach. In December 1942, something remarkable happened. Governor Julius Heil of Wisconsin, the state where DeStefano had committed his bank robbery, reduced his sentence. The reasons for this reduction remain unclear. Did the outfit use its influence? Was money exchanged? Did someone call in a political favor? We will never know for sure, but the result was clear. After serving just 9 years of his 40-year sentence, DeStefano was released in December 1944. He was 35 years old, and he had spent 11 years of his adult life in prison. But unlike many former prisoners who came out of prison broken or changed, DeStefano came out with a plan, connections, and knowledge. He was ready to build his empire, but first, he had one more brush with the law in 1947. Just 3 years after his release, DeStefano was arrested again, this time for dealing in fake sugar ration stamps. World War II had ended in 1945, but rationing continued for some things, and a black market in ration stamps was profitable. It was a relatively small crime compared to bank robbery, but it was still a federal crime. DeStefano was found guilty and sent back to federal prison. However, this sentence was short. Less than a year, by 1948, DeStefano was free again. And this time he was finally ready to do everything he had learned. Upon his release, DeStefano did something that might seem surprising. He got a real job through connections, possibly outfit-related. He got a civil service position as a boss at a garbage dump. It was humble work, far below what an ambitious criminal might have wanted. But it served a key purpose. It gave him real income that he could report to the IRS, giving him a legal cover for his activities. Many organized crime figures kept real businesses or jobs exactly for this reason. Al Capone had famously listed his job as used furniture dealer. But DeStefano's real work, his real empire, was about to begin. And the foundation of that empire would be built on pain, fear, and the soundless screams echoing from a suburban basement. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of change for Sam DeStefano. This was when the lessons he had learned from Paul Ricca in Leavenworth were put into practice. When the mad sand that would scare Chicago for 2 decades truly came out. DeStefano had a problem that many former prisoners faced. He needed money to start. Starting a loan sharking operation needed money to lend. And while the profits could be huge, you needed seed money to begin. But DeStefano had something many other former prisoners did not have. He knew where money could be found, and he was willing to take big risks to get it. According to FBI files and later testimony from associates, Dano used money from bank robberies to set up his first money. Whether he took part in these robberies himself or was given a cut by other criminals is unclear. But somehow he got several thousand in cash in the late 1940s. That was enough to begin building something big. DeStefano's first major investment was in real estate. He bought a 24-suite apartment building in Chicago. This was a smart move for several reasons. First, it gave a stream of real rental income that he could report to the IRS, helping to explain his lifestyle and spending. Second, real estate in post-war Chicago was a solid investment that went up in value over time. Third, and most importantly, the rental income became a way to clean his illegal profits and gave ready cash for bribes. Because the real foundation of DeStefano's empire was not just the money he lent. It was the corruption network he built to protect himself. And here, DeStefano proved to be very effective. Following Ricca's teachings, but adding his own new ideas, DeStefano set about systematically corrupting every part of the criminal justice system he might meet. He started with the police. Beat cops were the first line of defense against his illegal activities, so they had to be neutralized. DeStefano began finding which officers walked which beats, who supervised whom, and who might be corruptible. The approach was usually straightforward. He would approach an officer and offer money, a weekly or monthly payment in exchange for looking the other way. Most accepted, those he refused were not threatened at first. Fano would simply avoid working in their area or work around them, but over time, social pressure from corrupt co-workers often brought honest cops around. In a department where corruption was common, honesty was isolating. From beat cops, DeStefano moved up the chain. Sergeants, lieutenants, detectives, commanders. Each level needed more money, but each level gave more protection. DeStefano was methodical about it, keeping careful mental notes. He wisely avoided written records about who was on his payroll and at what rate. But police corruption alone was not enough if arrested. He needed to make sure that charges were dropped or reduced. This meant corrupting the court system itself. Prosecutors, bailiffs, court clerks, and most importantly, judges all became targets for DeStefano's bribes. Here, DeStefano made a price list that was very specific. According to testimony later, given by associates who became informants, DeStefano would boast about his ability to fix any case. The prices were clear. $800 could make a robbery charge disappear. $1,500 would take care of an attack case. And for murder, $20,000 was the going rate. These were not small sums in 1950s dollars. $20,000 was equal to more than $200,000 today. But for DeStefano, it was worth it. The ability to literally get away with murder was priceless to someone in his line of work. DeStefano would famously boast that there was not any case he could not fix, and the evidence suggests this was not an empty boast. Time and again, DeStefano would be arrested, charged with serious crimes, and the charges would strangely disappear or be reduced to small crimes. Witnesses would refuse to testify or change their stories. Evidence would be lost. Judges would rule in his favor on technical grounds. The corruption was so complete that police officers would sometimes take suspects directly to DeStefano's house rather than taking them to the police station. The process was almost silly. A man would be arrested for some crime. The arresting officers would drive him to DeStefano's home. DeStefano would agree on a price to fix the case. And then this is the truly bold part. After the bribe was paid, the suspect would be put on the juice. DeStefano would loan them the money for their own bribe. At his typical very high interest rates. Think about the twisted cleverness of this system. DeStefano was being paid by the Chicago outfit to run a loan sharking business. But he was also using the corrupt police force to bring customers directly to him. And those customers desperate to stay out of prison would accept his loans even at 25% weekly interest. They had no choice. It was either pay DeStefano's rates or go to prison. And once someone was in debt to DeStefano, they were trapped. The mathematics of compound interest made sure that most would never be able to pay back the original amount. They would make payment after payment, always falling further behind, always owing more. And if they could not pay, well, that is where Sam DeStefano truly came alive. Because DeStefano was not just a loan shark motivated by profit. Most loan sharks wanted their money back. Violence was a tool to make sure payback, a necessary evil of the business. But for DeStefano, violence was not a tool. It was the point. He enjoyed it. He wanted it. And more, he would set up his lending specifically to create chances for torture. Other loan sharks liked low-risk customers who would reliably pay. DeStefano liked the opposite. He actively looked for high-risk people who owed money. Drug addicts, out-of-control gamblers, desperate men with no resources and poor judgment. Why? Because these were the people most likely to not pay, and when they did not pay, DeStefano could enjoy his true passion. Torture. This was not shown immediately in the early 1950s. As DeStefano was building his operation, he kept at least the appearance of normalcy. He was married with a wife named Anita, and they had 3 children together in 1950. They bought a house at 1656 North Sayre Avenue in the Galewood neighborhood of Chicago. Dalewood was a middle-class, mostly Italian-American neighborhood on the city's northwest side. It was respectable, quiet, the kind of place where families raised children and neighbors knew each other. The house at 1656 North S was a nice suburban home. 2 stories, well kept with a garage and a basement. It was the kind of house that represented the American dream for immigrant families like the DeStefanos. But Sam DeStefano was about to turn that house into a nightmare. The basement of 1656 North S Avenue was not special in how it was built like thousands of Chicago basements. It was a concrete foundation space, cool and slightly wet, used for storage and utilities. The furnace was down there along with the water heater. Some boxes of old belongings, perhaps a workbench. Arty DeStefano and her children would have gone down there sometimes for perfectly normal reasons. But sometime in the early 1950s, Sam DeStefano began making changes to the basement. Repairs, soundproofing, the exact timeline is unclear. And DeStefano certainly did not apply for any building permits, but the result was chilling. The basement at 1656 North S became a soundproof torture room, and it was located directly under the family's living area. Imagine the layout of horror upstairs. Arty DeStefano prepared dinner in the kitchen. The children did homework, watched television, played. The family went about their normal suburban life. And directly under their feet, sometimes at the very same moment, men were being tortured to death. The soundproofing was effective enough that the family apparently never heard the screams. Or perhaps, and this is almost more upsetting, they did hear something, but knew better than to ask questions. Living with Sam DeStefano meant accepting certain realities, certain lines that could not be crossed. Arty DeStefano was not an innocent party in all this. She was married to a monster, and she knew what he was. The torture room itself had a collection of tools that DeStefano had gathered over time. Baseball bats for breaking bones, hammers for more exact breaks, blow torches for burning, ice picks for stabbing, rope for tying up, chains for holding. It was a toolkit of pain, carefully collected by a man who had given a lot of thought to causing hurt. But of all the tools in DeStefano's collection, one stood out as his signature weapon, the ice pick. It was about 6 inches of steel spike with a wooden or plastic handle. The kind of tool that had been common in American homes before the time of refrigeration, when ice had to be chipped from large blocks. For DeStefano, it became something else entirely. A precision tool for torture. The beauty of the ice pick from DeStefano's twisted view was its usefulness. A stabbing with an ice pick could be deadly if aimed at important organs or major blood vessels. But it could also be used to cause great pain without killing. Planned stab wounds through muscles into joints, through non-vital organs, could cause terrible pain while keeping the victim alive and awake. DeStefano became in his own twisted way an expert in the use of the ice pick. He knew where to stab to cause the most pain, the least death. He knew how to keep a man suffering for hours, and suffering is what he wanted. Associates who later testified to the FBI and in court described DeStefano's behavior during torture sessions in terms that were almost unbelievable. They said he would foam at the mouth while torturing victims. He would laugh out of control. He would shout and scream, apparently in a state of sexual or cruel joy. One associate described it as watching someone have a religious experience, except the god being worshipped was pain itself. DeStefano's approach to loan sharking was now clear in its full evil. Yes, he lent money, and yes, he charged very high interest rates. But the money was secondary. What DeStefano really wanted were victims. Men he could torture whose suffering he could enjoy. The loan sharking operation was in essence a delivery system for torture victims. He actively looked for the most desperate. Most weak borrowers, drug addicts, were perfect. Their need was constant, their judgment damaged. Their ability to pay back basically zero. Out-of-control gamblers were similarly ideal. They would borrow to cover gambling debts, then gamble the borrowed money, hoping to win big. They would lose and need to borrow more. Desperate businessmen. Men whose businesses were failing, who needed just a little money to make payroll or pay suppliers. These men would accept any terms, and when their businesses inevitably failed, they could not pay back. DeStefano would lend to these men hoping that they would not pay. The interest rates he charged, typically 20 to 25% per week, often set as 6 for 5, borrow $5. Pay back 6, almost guaranteed not paying. Even someone who borrowed a fairly small sum would quickly find themselves in impossible debt. And when they could not pay, they would get a visit, sometimes from one of DeStefano's collectors like Leo Foreman or Charles Grimaldi. Sometimes from DeStefano himself. They would be told to come to 1656 Norths to talk about the situation. Many went willingly, still hoping to work something out. To beg for more time to work something out. They did not understand that there was nothing to work out. DeStefano had been waiting for this moment, once in the house. They would be taken to the basement, usually. They went down the stairs on their own. Still talking, still trying to work something out. Then, at some point, the attack would come. Multiple men would grab the victim, overpower him, tie him up, and then the horror would begin. The stories that finally came out about what happened in that basement are almost too terrible to tell in detail. But they must be told because they show the truth of what Sam DeStefano was. This was not just a criminal who sometimes used violence. This was a cruel person who used crime as a way to do his darkest wants. The exact number of people Sam DeStefano tortured and murdered will never be known. The Chicago outfit did not keep records of such things, and DeStefano certainly did not. Many of his victims were people on the edges of society, drug addicts, small-time criminals. People whose disappearance would not cause serious investigation. But some cases became known either because bodies were found or because witnesses later testified. These cases give us a look into the deep hole. Arty Adler owned a small restaurant on Chicago's west side. The business was struggling as so many small businesses do, and Adler needed money. Perhaps he needed to pay suppliers or make payroll or cover rent. Whatever the specific need, Adler made the important decision to borrow from Sam DeStefano. The loan was probably small by DeStefano's standards. A few thousand perhaps. The terms were the standard ruinous rates. At first, Adler made his payments. But running a restaurant is hard, and profits are small. And inevitably Adler fell behind. Not dramatically behind, not yet refusing to pay. Just behind, a payment missed here. A payment late there for a normal loan shark. This would cause a warning visit. Some muscle would show up at the restaurant. Make it clear that payments needed to be made. Perhaps rough Adler up a little to make the point, but for DeStefano, this was a chance. Adler was told to come to 1656 North S Avenue to talk about his debt. He came probably scared, but still hopeful that he could work something out. Perhaps he brought some money, a partial payment to show good faith. Perhaps he had a plan for how he would catch up on payments. None of it mattered in the basement. Adler was tied up and then DeStefano went to work with his ice pick. The details of the torture session are thankfully lost to history. But we know it was big. We know Adler was stabbed multiple times. We know he suffered greatly, and we know that at some point during the torture, Arty Adler's heart gave out. He died of cardiac arrest before DeStefano was finished with him. For some torturers, this might have been a disappointment. The victim dying too soon, robbing them of the long suffering they wanted. For DeStefano, it seems to have been just a problem. Now he had a body to get rid of. This was winter in Chicago. And DeStefano used the weather to his advantage. Adler's body was taken to a sewer near the corner of North S and Harlem Avenues, not far from DeStefano's house. The body was pushed into the sewer where the winter ice and freezing temperatures acted as a natural preserver. Snow and ice built up on top, hiding the body completely. Months passed, winter turned to spring. The ice began to melt, and one day in 1964, sanitation workers responding to a backed-up sewer line made a terrible discovery. They found a body perfectly kept by the winter ice. Now thawing in the spring warmth, the body of Arty Adler. The murder was investigated, of course. The stab wounds were recorded. The cause of death was found. Detectives talked to people who knew Adler, trying to find who might have wanted him dead. And inevitably, Sam DeStefano's name came up. Adler had owed him money, but proving DeStefano's guilt was another matter entirely. Witnesses were scared or paid off. Physical evidence was small. And DeStefano had his corruption network. The investigation stalled and finally went cold. Just another unsolved murder in a city that had thousands of them. If Arty Adler's story was scary for its simple brutality, Peter Capaldi's story was worse because it showed the depths of DeStefano's cruelty. This was not just about torture, it was about psychological destruction, about humiliation, about turning violence into a show. Peter Capaldi was one of DeStefano's collectors, men who worked for DeStefano. Going around to people who owed money and collecting payments, it was a dangerous job, but it paid well. And for men in the underworld, chances were limited. Capaldi had been doing the job for some time. Apparently successfully, but Capaldi made a key mistake. He ran away to Wisconsin with $25,000 of DeStefano's money. Whether he had been taking payments over time or simply grabbed money and ran is unclear. But the result was the same. He had stolen from Sam DeStefano. And that meant his life was over. The only question was how terrible his death would be. DeStefano's network tracked Capaldi to Wisconsin. He was found, grabbed, and brought back to Chicago. Most mob bosses would have simply killed him. A bullet to the head, body dumped somewhere, message sent. But DeStefano was not most mob bosses. Capaldi was taken to Mario's restaurant, a Chicago place owned by DeStefano's brother, Mario, in the back room of the restaurant. There was a radiator, the old-fashioned kind, cast iron, heated by boiling water circulating through it. Capaldi was stripped naked and chained to this radiator while it was working at full heat. The pain of being pressed against a boiling radiator is hard to imagine. The skin blisters and burns immediately. The smell of burning flesh fills the air. The victim's natural instinct is to pull away. But the chains prevent any escape for 3 days. Peter Capaldi was kept chained to that radiator. Not continuously, he would have died almost immediately. But again and again, chained to the radiator until he passed out from pain. Brought back, then chained again, a cycle of burning pain repeated for 72 hours. But even this was not enough for DeStefano. He wanted more than Capaldi's suffering. He wanted to destroy him completely, to humiliate him beyond any possible saving. And so DeStefano arranged something that stands as perhaps the most psychologically cruel act in a career filled with cruelty. DeStefano contacted Capaldi's family, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers and sisters. He invited them to an honorary dinner at Mario's restaurant. The invitation was formal, dignified even. It was to be a multi-course Italian dinner, a celebration. The family was told that Peter would be there, that he would be the guest of honor. They were told to dress nicely, to come prepared for a special evening. The family came, probably confused but hopeful. Perhaps they thought Peter had done something good, earned some special recognition. Perhaps they were just relieved to hear he was alive, that he would be there. They were seated in the dining room of Mario's restaurant and a wonderful meal was served. Multiple courses, fine wine, all the signs of a celebration. Throughout the meal, DeStefano was charming, playing the part of kind host. He asked about the family, made small talk, made sure everyone was eating well. The family kept asking when Peter would arrive. Soon, DeStefano assured them, the guest of honor will arrive soon. The meal ended, dessert and coffee were served. And then DeStefano stood and said that it was time for the guest of honor to make his appearance. Peter Capaldi was dragged into the dining room. He was naked, or nearly so. His body was covered in terrible burns from the radiator. He was barely awake, kept alive only because DeStefano wanted him alive for this moment. He was thrown down at his mother's feet. The family's horror and shock were exactly what DeStefano wanted. He had destroyed Capelli physically, but now he would destroy him in front of his family. The humiliation would be complete, but Fano was not finished. He told the gathered family that they needed to put the fire out. He ordered them to urinate on Capoi. All of them, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers and sisters, one by one. They were forced to urinate on him while he lay burned and barely awake on the floor of the restaurant. We can only imagine what this did to Capelli psychologically. To his family psychologically, the trauma of this event would have been deep and permanent. DeStefano had turned Capelli's own family into tools of his humiliation. The psychological torture was arguably worse than the physical torture. And then after all this, Capelletti was let go. But not out of mercy, out of calculation. The family had paid the debt, every penny of the $25,000 plus interest. And DeStefano had gotten what he really wanted. A story that would spread through the underworld. A legend of what happened to people who crossed Sam DeStefano. Capelli was allowed to live because his continued existence would serve as a warning. Every time someone saw him, saw his scars, heard his story, they would be reminded of what DeStefano could do. Peter Capoi survived physically, but he was destroyed in every meaningful way. The man who came out of that restaurant was not the same man who had stolen $25,000. He was a broken shell, a warning, a sign of the depths of human cruelty. If the Capelli story showed DeStefano's cruelty at its most psychologically cold, the William Action Jackson case showed it at its most physically extreme. This murder was so brutal, so long that even tough FBI agents who had seen years of mob violence were shocked by the details. William Jackson was a large man, weighing over 300 pounds. He worked as a collector for DeStefano's juice loan operation. And by most accounts, he was good at his job. He was scary because of his size, but also knew when to be persuasive rather than violent. He had been working for DeStefano for some time. But at some point the FBI approached Jackson. We do not know the exact details of this first contact, but we can guess what happened. The FBI was investigating DeStefano and the Chicago outfit, and they needed information. Jackson was offered a deal. Give information about DeStefano's operations, testify if needed, and in exchange, the FBI would give protection and help with any legal troubles Jackson might have. Whether Jackson actually became an informant or merely was suspected of doing so is unclear. What matters is that DeStefano became sure that Action Jackson was talking to the FBI in the paranoid world of organized crime. Suspicion alone was enough. Jackson was marked for death. But DeStefano did not want a simple killing. He wanted to make an example, to send a message about what happened to informants. And he wanted to enjoy his cruel wants on a big scale. Jackson was tricked to a South Side location, a meat rendering factory, the kind of industrial place where animal bodies were processed. It was the perfect location for what DeStefano had planned. Isolated, soundproofed by its industrial nature, and equipped with all the tools DeStefano would need in the factory was a meat hook. The industrial kind used to hang beef and pork bodies. These hooks are made to support hundreds of pounds of weight. Jackson was grabbed by multiple men, overpowered despite his size, and hung on the meat hook. Different accounts differ on exactly how he was hung. Some say by chains under his arms, some say by hooks through his back muscles. What is clear is that he was hung up, his feet off the ground, unable to escape, and then for 3 days, Sam DeStefano tortured Action Jackson. The details that finally came out from informant testimony and FBI reports are almost too horrible to tell. But they must be told because they show the reality of what DeStefano could do. These are not exaggerations or mob made-up stories. These are recorded facts from court testimony. DeStefano started with Jackson's knees. Using a hammer, he carefully broke both kneecaps. The pain would have been terrible, but Jackson could not collapse, could not fall. He was hung on the meat hook. Then Fano moved to other parts of Jackson's body. The ice pick was used to stab Jackson dozens of times through muscles and organs, carefully placed to cause the most pain without causing death. A blowtorch was used to burn Jackson. The specific areas aimed at were particularly cruel. The private parts were burned, adding sexual humiliation to physical pain. The blowtorch would be used until Jackson passed out from pain and he would be brought back. And the process would continue at some point. DeStefano injected Jackson with air. This caused Jackson's body to swell in a disgusting way, adding to his suffering and disfigurement. The purpose of this seems to have been purely cruel. It served no practical purpose, but to cause extra pain and horror. Throughout this 3-day event, DeStefano would sometimes leave, go about his business, then return to continue the torture. Other members of his crew were present at different times. Some took part actively, others watched, none tried to stop it. In the world of the Chicago outfit, you did not question Sam DeStefano. After about 36 hours of continuous torture, Jackson died of traumatic shock. His body had simply reached the limit of what it could take. His heart stopped. The torture was finally over. But Vano still had one last message to send. Jackson's body, now weighing even more than his living weight because of the swelling from the injected air, was stuffed into the trunk of a Cadillac. The car was driven to Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago and left. It was found within hours, and when police opened the trunk, they found Jackson's disgustingly swollen, tortured body. The message was clear. This is what happens to informants. This is what happens to people who betray Sam DeStefano. This is what happens when you cross the Chicago outfit. The Jackson murder was investigated a lot. The FBI knew exactly who was responsible, Sam DeStefano and his crew. But proving it in court was another matter. The witnesses who could testify were either dead, scared, or part of it. Physical evidence was small, and DeStefano had his corruption network. No charges were ever filed in the Action Jackson murder. But the murder had results DeStefano did not expect. The pure brutality of it, the long nature of the torture, the public way the body was shown, it got attention from federal law enforcement at the highest levels. The FBI began putting more resources into taking down DeStefano. Agents like William Reimer made it their personal mission to bring DeStefano to justice, and it made other members of the Chicago outfit nervous. Even in an organization built on violence, there were limits. What DeStefano had done to Action Jackson went beyond business, beyond sending a message. It was the work of a cruel person, a psychopath, someone who was out of control. The outfit leadership began to worry that DeStefano's behavior would bring too much heat, too much federal attention. The seeds of his final downfall were being planted. If Sam DeStefano's cruelty defined him privately, his strange public image defined him publicly. He was not just a violent criminal, he was a show. A man whose behavior was so outrageous that it could not be explained. Perhaps the most famous part of DeStefano's public image was his habit of wearing pajamas everywhere. Not sometimes, not just at home, but everywhere in court, on the streets to meetings. Pajamas, sometimes they were silk, sometimes flannel, sometimes with patterns, but always pajamas. Why, no one knows for sure. Some thought it was a planned strategy to look mentally unfit for trial. If he looked crazy, maybe he could claim insanity. Others thought it was real mental illness showing in odd ways. Still others believed it was pure disrespect. DeStefano showing his dislike for the legal system, for social rules, for the very idea that he should follow expectations. Whatever the reason, it worked in its way. Every news story about DeStefano mentioned the pajamas. Every courtroom sketch artist drew the pajamas. He became known as the man who wore pajamas to court. And the image became part of his identity. The ice pick in his pocket was another constant. DeStefano carried his signature weapon with him at all times, the way another man might carry a lucky coin or a pocket knife. It was a statement. a threat, a reminder. Everyone who knew DeStefano knew about the ice pick. Everyone knew what he did with it. His courtroom behavior was famous. When forced to appear in court for different charges over the years, DeStefano would sometimes arrive on a stretcher. Claiming illness, he would shout through a bullhorn. Disrupting the court, he would talk in a way that did not make sense, mixing legal arguments with nonsense, making it nearly impossible for the court to go on efficiently. Judges would hold him in contempt. He would be fined, sometimes jailed briefly. None of it mattered. DeStefano was playing a longer game, creating chaos, running out the clock, making himself such a difficult defendant that prosecutors would sometimes accept plea deals just to avoid the circus of a full trial. His treatment of his own family showed another side of his madness. His wife, Anita, lived in constant fear. Multiple witnesses later testified that DeStefano would force her to play Russian roulette, putting a revolver to her head with one round in the cylinder and pulling the trigger. The psychological torture of this is hard to understand. The click of the hammer on an empty chamber, the relief that you have survived, knowing that next time or the time after that, the bullet might be there. It is torture without physical injury, at least until the bullet finally comes. Why would Anita stay? Why not leave? Take the children, run away. The answer is complex, but comes down to fear and the way abuse works. Leaving DeStefano would have meant certain death for her and possibly her children. In the world Vano lived in, there was no such thing as divorce. You stayed and you endured, or you died. Those were the options. DeStefano's sexual violence went beyond his family. He raped a woman in a nightclub, not in a back room or a bathroom, but openly in public. The act was so bold, so disrespectful of law and social rules, that it shocked even people familiar with mob behavior. The woman never pressed charges. How could she? Who would testify against Sam DeStefano? What judge would find him guilty? What police would arrest him? His interactions with the FBI were strange, even by his standards. FBI agents would sometimes visit Fano's home, either to question him or to let him know he was being watched. This was standard practice. The FBI liked to remind organized crime figures that they were under watch. DeStefano's response was to show himself to the agents on multiple times. FBI agents arriving at his door would be greeted by DeStefano, naked or partly naked, sometimes clearly touching himself. It was a power move, a way of showing disrespect, of asserting control through shock and breaking social rules. On one time, DeStefano served coffee to FBI agent William Reimer. Reimer accepted the coffee and drank it, trying to keep professional calm despite DeStefano's strange behavior. After Reimer left, DeStefano allegedly bragged to associates that the coffee had actually been his urine. Whether this was true or just a boast is unclear, but Reimer apparently believed it. He never accepted a drink from a suspect again for the rest of his career. During police interviews, DeStefano would sometimes foam at the mouth, literally. White foam would appear at the corners of his mouth as he became upset. He would laugh out of control at wrong times. He would make statements that seemed disconnected from reality, then suddenly make a clear legal argument, then go back into not making sense. Was this real mental illness? Or was it an act? The answer is probably both. DeStefano was really unstable, really cruel, really strange in his behavior, but he was also smart enough to make these qualities bigger when it served his purposes, to use his madness as a shield and a weapon. There were rumors, never confirmed, of devil worship. Charles Grimaldi, one of DeStefano's associates who finally became an informant, claimed that DeStefano worshipped Satan, that he saw his torture victims as gifts to dark powers. Whether this was literally true, or metaphorically true, or not true at all, is impossible to say. But it fit the image, fit the reality of what DeStefano was. If a man like DeStefano were to worship anything, it would be the devil. One of DeStefano's strangest habits was giving expensive engraved gold watches to people. including some of his victims, associates who survived their meetings with DeStefano, would sometimes get a watch afterward. A gift from Mad Sam. The watches were beautiful, valuable, and deeply creepy. The engraving would typically say something like, "To my dear friend," followed by the date. The logic, according to DeStefano's twisted thinking, was that if he finally killed someone, the watch would prove how close they were. It was a sick joke, but also a power move. Every time the victim looked at that watch, they would be reminded that Sam DeStefano had given it to them. They would be reminded of what he could do. They would be reminded that their life existed at his pleasure. All of this, the pajamas, the ice pick, the strange behavior, the sexual violence, the psychological torture, created an image of Sam DeStefano that went beyond his actual crimes. He became a legend in Chicago, a boogeyman, a name that parents would use to frighten children. Behave or Mad Sam will get you. It was a joke. Except it was not, because Mad Sam was real, and he really did get people. By 1963, Sam DeStefano's criminal empire was at its highest point. He was rich, feared, and seemingly untouchable. His loan sharking operation was making huge profits. His corruption network protected him from being charged. His reputation for violence kept people who owed money in line and competitors away. But pride comes before a fall. DeStefano was about to make a key mistake. Leo Foreman was a real estate agent who also worked as a juice collector for DeStefano. This was a common arrangement. Someone with a real job would also work part-time collecting debts for loan sharks. It gave cover and extra income. Foreman had been doing this work for some time and was generally thought reliable. But in November 1963, something went wrong. The details of what caused the argument between DeStefano and Foreman are lost to history. Perhaps Foreman had been taking money. Perhaps he had shown DeStefano not enough respect. Perhaps it was something small that got bigger. Whatever the cause, DeStefano visited Foreman's real estate office, and a violent argument happened. Witnesses in next-door offices heard shouting. They heard furniture being knocked over. They heard threats. And then they saw something almost unthinkable. Leo Foreman physically threw Sam DeStefano out of his office. Understand what this meant, Sam DeStefano, a man who had tortured dozens of people, who had killed multiple men, who was feared throughout Chicago's underworld, was physically thrown out of an office by one of his own workers. The humiliation was total. The insult was public. Witnesses had seen it in the ranked, honor-based world of organized crime. This could not stand. DeStefano's reputation depended on fear, and fear depended on the absolute certainty that crossing him meant death. If Leo Foreman could throw him out of an office and survive, what would that tell other people who owed money? What would that tell other members of the crew? DeStefano went into hiding immediately. This might seem like a strange reaction. Why would the person who hurts others hide? But it made sense in context. DeStefano was humiliated and very angry, which made him dangerous even by his standards. He needed to cool down, to plan, to figure out how to respond to this insult in a way that would bring back his reputation and satisfy his need for revenge. But even in hiding, even while planning his revenge, DeStefano was smart enough to be patient. He did not act right away. He did not send men to kill Foreman right away. That would be expected, and Foreman would be on guard. Instead, DeStefano waited, letting time pass, letting Foreman's guard drop, and while he waited, he got his most trusted associates in a plan. Tony Spelletro and Chucky Grimaldi were two of DeStefano's most reliable enforcers. Spelletro in particular was a rising star in the Chicago outfit. Young, ambitious, smart, and completely ruthless. He had taken part in multiple murders for the outfit and was known for his willingness to do whatever was necessary. Grimaldi was older, more experienced, and equally ruthless. Both men understood what needed to be done about the Leo Foreman situation. Weeks after the first meeting, Spelletro and Grimaldi made contact with Leo Foreman. The message was simple. Sam DeStefano wanted to let bygones be bygones. He wanted to make peace, to put the whole ugly incident behind him. The argument had been a misunderstanding. Tempers had flared. Things had been said that should not have been said. But there was no reason they could not move past it. Business was business, and they should continue working together. This was the trap, and Foreman walked right into it. Perhaps he wanted to believe that making peace was possible. Perhaps he felt he had no choice but to accept the offer. Perhaps he was simply naive about what Sam DeStefano could do. Whatever his reasoning, Leo Foreman agreed to meet with DeStefano. The location chosen was the home of Mario DeStefano, Sam's brother in Cicero, Illinois. Cicero was a suburb of Chicago famous for its mob connections. Al Capone had run much of his operation from Cicero in the 1920s. By 1963, it remained an outfit stronghold. A place where the mob's influence was so strong that it worked almost as a second government. Mario DeStefano's home was a middle-class suburban house, not special from the outside. But like Sam's house, it had a basement. And that basement was about to become the scene of one of the most brutal murders in Chicago's history of brutal murders. Leo Foreman arrived at the house in late November or early December 1963. He was greeted warmly by Spelletro and Grimaldi. There was small talk, probably some discussion of business. The atmosphere was friendly, or at least professionally polite. Foreman was told that Sam would be arriving soon, that they should wait downstairs where they could talk privately. Foreman walked down the basement stairs, still not suspecting, or at least hoping that his suspicions were wrong. And that is when the trap closed, the moment Leo Foreman reached the basement. Multiple men grabbed him, Spelletro, Grimaldi, Mario DeStefano. They overpowered him quickly. Foreman was a grown man. But he was outnumbered, and they had the advantage of surprise. Within seconds, he was controlled. His hands tied, his movement limited, and then, before Sam even arrived, the softening up began. This was standard procedure in mob torture. You started breaking down the victim before the main event. Spelletro began working on Foreman's knees with a hammer. The first blow broke the kneecap. The pain would have been impossible to describe. Foreman would have screamed, begged, pleaded. The hammer came down again and again. Both knees were destroyed. Then the hammer moved to other areas, the head. Though not hard enough to knock Foreman unconscious, DeStefano would want him awake for what came next. The ribs carefully breaking several, the groin, causing pain that went beyond physical into the psychological. By the time Sam DeStefano arrived, Leo Foreman had already taken more pain than most people experience in a lifetime. But the real torture was about to begin. DeStefano entered the basement and immediately flew into one of his characteristic rages. He was screaming, spitting, foaming at the mouth. "I told you I get you." He shouted at Foreman, "Greed just got you killed." It is unclear what he meant by greed. Perhaps Foreman had been accused of taking money. Perhaps it was just a reason for the murder. Perhaps it was the talking of a madman. DeStefano pulled out his ice pick. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Planning for Leo Foreman had humiliated him, had thrown him out of an office, had disrespected him in front of witnesses. And now Foreman would pay the final price. The ice pit went down once, twice, 3 times. Planned locations through muscles into organs made to cause the most pain without causing immediate death. DeStefano knew exactly where to strike. He had done this so many times before. He was an expert in the map of pain. Foreman was screaming, begging for his life, promising anything if DeStefano would just stop. But DeStefano was not interested in money or promises. He was interested in suffering. His own suffering, the humiliation he had felt, now changed and multiplied and reflected back on the Foreman. DeStefano pulled out a gun and shot Foreman, but not in the head or heart, in the buttocks, again and again. The bullets ripped through flesh, but avoided important organs. The pain was terrible, but it would not kill him. Not quickly, anyway. A butcher knife appeared later. Testimony never made clear where it came from or who brought it. DeStefano used it to cut Foreman, adding to the music of pain. Foreman was bleeding from multiple wounds now, his blood pooling on the basement floor. According to later testimony from Chucky Grimaldi, who saw the whole event and finally became an informant, the torture continued for a long time. How long exactly is unclear. Grimaldi's testimony changed over the years, and time feeling during such traumatic events is notoriously unreliable. But it was long enough that Foreman begged for death. Long enough that even the tough criminals present began to feel uncomfortable. Sam DeStefano was in a state of joy throughout. He was laughing, giggling, making jokes. He would make fun of Foreman, asking him if he regretted throwing him out of the office. He would describe what he was going to do next, building anticipation and dread. He was by all accounts having the time of his life. Finally, when DeStefano was satisfied, when Foreman had suffered enough, the final shot was fired. A bullet to the head, execution style. Leo Foreman was dead, but the work was not finished. The body needed to be disposed of. This was not like dumping Arty Adler in a sewer in winter. This was a high-profile murder of someone who had known connections to DeStefano. If the body was found and linked back to them, even DeStefano's corruption network might not save him. The solution was simple, but effective. Foreman's body was wrapped in plastic and placed in the trunk of a stolen car. The car was driven to Chicago South Side and left. It would be found finally. But by then, any physical evidence linking the murder to DeStefano would be worse or lost, and that as far as DeStefano was concerned, was that Leo Foreman was dead. The insult had been avenged. His reputation was brought back. Life would continue as before, except it would not. Because while DeStefano did not know it yet, the Leo Foreman murder would be the beginning of the end for Mad Sam DeStefano. The 1960s saw Sam DeStefano at the height of his power, but also saw the beginning of his downfall. Federal law enforcement was becoming more sophisticated in its approach to organized crime. The FBI was developing new investigative ways. Prosecutors were learning how to work around corrupt local police and judges, and Veno's high profile was making him a priority target in 1962. DeStefano had been arrested for trying to represent Vito Zaccagnini in a forgery trial. DeStefano had no law degree, no legal training whatsoever, but he tried to act as Zaccagnini's attorney when told he could not. He demanded the names of all state's attorney and sheriff employees as possible witnesses. It was pure disruption, pure chaos, made to make the legal proceedings as difficult as possible. The incident was typical of DeStefano's approach to the legal system. Treat it as a joke, create confusion, run out the clock. It usually worked, but it also drew attention to him. Made him a target for prosecutors who were tired of his antics. In 1965, DeStefano was found guilty of conspiracy and sentenced to 3 to 5 years in federal prison. The exact details of the conspiracy are lost to the historical record, but it represented a big win for federal prosecutors for once. DeStefano's corruption network had not been enough to prevent conviction. However, DeStefano stayed free on bond while appealing the conviction. This was standard procedure, but it gave him years of continued freedom. Years to continue his criminal activities. He was rich enough to afford the best appeals lawyers, and the appeal process moved slowly through the courts. By February 22, 1972, DeStefano was sentenced to 3.5 years for threatening a witness. This incident had happened in an elevator in the Chicago-Dirksen Federal Building. DeStefano had met Charles Grimaldi, who was cooperating with federal investigators in a moment of rage. Veno had directly threatened Grimaldi in front of witnesses. It was an incredibly stupid move, threatening a witness in a federal building. But it showed Fano's state of mind. He was losing control, becoming more reckless. Later in 1972, Vano was charged for illegal firearm possession as a convicted felon. This was a technical charge, but it added to the growing legal pressure. DeStefano was facing possible prison time on multiple fronts. His appeals were running out. The walls were closing in. But it was what happened next that would seal his fate. Charles Chucky Grimaldi was a longtime member of DeStefano's crew. He had taken part in multiple murders, including the Leo Foreman killing. He had been with DeStefano for years, had seen countless acts of violence and torture. He was a criminal through and through. Not someone you would expect to cooperate with law enforcement. But by 1972, Grimaldi had his own legal problems. He was facing serious charges and federal prosecutors made him an offer. Testify against DeStefano and Spilotro. Tell us everything you know about the Foreman murder and other crimes, and we will help you. Why did Grimaldi flip? The reasons were complex. Partly it was self-preservation. He was facing long prison time. Partly it was the realization that the outfit was not what it once was, that the old codes of silence were breaking down. But partly, according to his later statements, it was because he was really disturbed by what he had seen. Even tough criminals have limits. And DeStefano's cruelty had gone beyond Grimaldi's ability to explain it. Grimaldi began cooperating with the FBI. He gave detailed testimony about the Leo Foreman murder. He described how Foreman had been tricked to Mario Vano's house, how he had been tortured for hours, how Sam DeStefano had personally killed him. He named names: Sam DeStefano, Mario Dano, and Tony Spilotro. The FBI now had what they needed: an eyewitness willing to testify. In 1973, Sam DeStefano, Mario Dano, and Tony Spilotro were charged for the murder of Leo Foreman. A trial date was set for May 1973, for the first time in his criminal career. Sam DeStefano was facing a murder charge that might actually stick. Sam DeStefano's response to the murder charge was characteristically strange. He demanded to represent himself at trial, the judge. Reluctant, but bound by DeStefano's constitutional right to represent himself, allowed it. This was exactly what DeStefano wanted: control of the courtroom, the ability to disrupt and delay. DeStefano's courtroom behavior during the pre-trial hearings was extraordinary, even by his standards. He arrived on a stretcher, claiming illness. He wore his signature pajamas. He shouted through a bullhorn. He talked in a way that did not make sense, mixing legal arguments with nonsense, making strange accusations, going off on subjects that had nothing to do with the case. The media loved it. Every newspaper in Chicago covered the hearings. The story was irresistible. The famous mob torturer wearing pajamas, shouting through a bullhorn, representing himself in a murder trial. It was a show, and DeStefano was the star. But this high-profile attention had an unintended result in the past. DeStefano's trials had been relatively low-key affairs that he could control through his corruption network. Judges could be bribed, jurors could be scared, witnesses could be paid off, but with the entire city watching, with newspapers covering every moment, with federal prosecutors paying close attention, the corruption was harder to achieve. The spotlight that DeStefano looked for was also the spotlight that would show him. Mario DeStefano and Tony Spilotro, the other defendants, watched this circus with growing alarm. They had their own lawyers, good criminal defense lawyers who understood how to defend mob cases. But those lawyers could not control Sandano. His strange behavior, his rants, his publicity-seeking antics. They were putting everyone's defense in danger. The lawyers met with Mario and Spilotro privately. The message was clear: Sam DeStefano was going to sink the whole case. His behavior was making them all look guilty. His talking was pushing away the judge and possible jurors. His high profile was getting too much attention. If he continued this way, they would all be found guilty. But there was a bigger problem. Sam DeStefano was becoming a problem not just to this case, but to the entire Chicago outfit. His behavior was getting federal attention to the organization. His torture murders were so extreme that they were causing public outcry. Law enforcement agencies that might have tolerated regular mob violence were under pressure to do something about DeStefano. And perhaps most dangerously, there was a real chance that DeStefano, in his increasingly changeable state, might say something in court that would involve others. He might show organizational secrets in one of his rants. He might name names. He was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and increasingly reckless. His Chicago outfit had built an empire on secrecy. Omerta, the code of silence, Sam DeStefano. Wearing pajamas and shouting through a bullhorn in a courtroom full of reporters represented everything the outfit feared. Word reached Tony Accardo, the boss of the Chicago outfit. Accardo was the opposite of DeStefano in every way. Quiet, smart, strategic, and completely ruthless when necessary. He had survived years in organized crime by being careful, by avoiding publicity, by removing threats before they could appear. And Sam DeStefano had become a threat. Accardo called a meeting. The location and exact date are lost to history. These meetings left no records, no paper trail. But the decision made at that meeting was clear. Sam DeStefano had to die. The authorization was given. And in a move that showed just how much of a problem DeStefano had become. Even his own brother Mario voted yes, the man who had stood by Sam through years of crime, who had taken part in murders alongside him, who had given his basement for the Foreman torture. Even Mario DeStefano agreed that Sam had to go. The only question was how and who. In the ranked world of the Chicago outfit, murder needed authorization. You could not just kill another mob member or associate without permission from the leadership. The penalty for unauthorized murder was death. So even though everyone in DeStefano's crew knew he had to die, they needed official sanction. Tony Accardo gave that sanction, but he added a condition. DeStefano should be killed by his own crew. This served multiple purposes. First, it sent a message about loyalty. The outfit came before personal relationships, before family even. Second, it was practical. DeStefano's own crew had access to him, knew his routines, could get close without raising suspicion. Third, it was a test if the crew would kill one of their own. It proved their loyalty to the organization. The assignment was given to Tony Spelletro and Mario DeStefano. They were co-defendants in the Foreman case. They worked closely with Sam, and they had the most to lose if Sam's courtroom behavior continued. They also had the best chance to get close to him. Planning the murder needed careful thought. DeStefano was paranoid, always had been, and now with the Foreman trial coming, he was even more on guard. He knew he had enemies. He knew that some people in the outfit thought he was a problem. He carried a gun. He changed his routines. Getting to him would not be easy, but everyone has weaknesses. And DeStefano's weakness was his belief in his own invincibility. He had survived for years in the criminal underworld. He had committed countless crimes and never served important time. He had tortured and killed dozens of men and never faced justice. On some level, he believed he was untouchable, that his corruption network and his reputation would always protect him. Spelletro and Mario decided to use Chucky Grimaldi as bait. They would tell Sam that they had found Grimaldi's safe house, the place where he was being kept under FBI protection. This would appeal to Sam on multiple levels. It would give him a chance to kill the man who had betrayed him, to remove the key witness in the Foreman case, and to prove once again that no one could cross Sam DeStefano and live. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would arrange to meet Sam at his garage at 1656 North S Avenue. They would tell him they needed to discuss the plan to get to Grimaldi, to show him maps and information. Sam would come expecting to plan a murder. He would not realize he was walking into his own execution. The morning of April 14, 1973. Started like any other morning for Sam DeStefano. He was 63 years old. And despite years of criminal violence, he had survived. He had outlived most of his contemporaries from the 42 gang days. He was rich, feared, and preparing for a trial that he seemed to think he could win through sheer force of personality. Spelotro and Mario contacted Sam and told him they had important news about Grimaldi. They had found him. They knew where the FBI was keeping him. They wanted to meet to discuss how to go on. The location they proposed was Sam's own garage. Familiar, comfortable, seemingly safe, Sam agreed immediately. The chance to kill Grimaldi, to remove the witness who could send him to prison for life, was too good to pass up. He probably spent the morning thinking about how he would torture Grimaldi when they got to him. The ice pick would come out again. There would be hours of pain before the end. It would be glorious. 1656 North S Avenue looked the same as it had for 20 years. The suburban home where Sam had raised his children, where his wife still lived in fear, where the basement torture room had taken so many victims. The garage was attached to the house, a standard single-car garage. Typical of Chicago homes from that time, Sam walked to the garage that morning without suspicion. Why would he be suspicious? These were his brother and his trusted associate. They were meeting at his home. On his territory, everything seemed normal. Tony Spelotro and Mario DeStefano were waiting in the garage when Sam arrived. There was probably some small talk, some discussion of the trial, some questions about the supposed information on Grimaldi's location. Sam was focused on the conversation, thinking about his revenge, planning his next torture session. Spelotro reached into his coat. In one smooth motion, he pulled out a shotgun. The barrel was inches from Sam DeStefano's face. Sam had maybe a second to realize what was happening, to understand that he had been betrayed, that his own brother and his trusted lieutenant were about to kill him. The first blast tore off Sam's left arm completely. The force of a shotgun at close range is devastating. Flesh, bone, muscle, all destroyed in an instant. Sam was thrown back by the hit, his body already going into shock. The second blast hit Sam in the chest at this range. The shotgun pellets did not have time to spread. They hit in a tight pattern, ripping through his heart, his lungs, his major blood vessels. It was instantly deadly. Sam, Mad Sam DeStefano, the man who had tortured dozens of people, who had kept victims alive for days just to make their suffering longer, who had built a soundproof torture room under his family home, who had scared Chicago for 30 years, died in seconds. It was a kind death, far more kind than any death he had caused on his victims. The irony was not lost on those who knew the story. The man who had given his life to making suffering longer died quickly, almost painlessly. The man who had killed so many in fancy theatrical ways died in a simple business-like execution. The man who had trusted no one was betrayed by his own brother. Spelotro and Mario left the garage immediately. They had done what the outfit had ordered them to do. They had removed a problem, a threat to the organization. Sam's body lay in a pool of blood in his own garage. The same garage where he had parked every day for 2 decades. Just feet from the house where his family lived. The murder was officially unsolved. No arrests were ever made. The code of silence omerta held. No witnesses came forward. No one talked. This was mob justice. And the mob took care of its own, even when taking care meant execution. FBI agent William Rammer named Tony Spelotro as the main suspect almost immediately. The Bureau knew how these things worked. They knew about the Foreman trial, knew about Vano's changeable behavior, knew that the outfit had reason to want him dead. But knowing and proving were 2 different things. Without witnesses, without physical evidence linking Spelotro to the scene, there was no case to make. The Chicago police investigation was basic at best. Fano had been a monster, a cruel person, a murderer of countless people. Few people in law enforcement were going to work overtime to solve his murder. He had been killed by his own kind, by the same violent underworld he had lived in for years. In a twisted way, it was justice. Not legal justice, but a kind of cosmic justice. The man who had lived by violence died by violence. The Leo Foreman murder trial went on without Sam DeStefano. Mario DePano and Tony Spelletro stood trial, represented by good lawyers. Without the chaos that Sam's presence would have brought. Chucky Grimaldi testified as he had promised. He described in detail how Leo Foreman had been tricked to Mario's house, how he had been tortured, how Sam DeStefano had personally killed him. The testimony was damning, graphic, and believable. Grimaldi had taken part in the murder himself, so he knew every detail. Mario DePano was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. For a man in his 60s, it was effectively a life sentence. The brother who had stood by Sam through everything, who had voted for his execution, now faced the rest of his life in prison. But the story was not over for Mario. On July 9, 1975, just 2 years after Sam's death, Mario's conviction was overturned on appeal, some technicality, some procedural error. The details are lost to history, but the result was clear. Mario was going to get a retrial. He was released on bond while waiting for the new trial. On August 12, 1975, just a month after his conviction was overturned, Mario DeStefano died of a heart attack. He was 64 years old. The official cause was natural causes, heart failure brought on by stress and poor health. But in the world of organized crime, there are no coincidences. Some thought that the outfit had Mario killed to prevent him from talking at his retrial, to make sure that whatever secrets he knew died with him. Others believed it really was natural causes, that the stress of the trial, the murder of his brother, the years of criminal life had simply caught up with him either way. Mario died without ever facing justice for the Leo Foreman murder. The charges died with him. Tony Spelletro was found not guilty in the Foreman murder. The jury found reasonable doubt in Grimaldi's testimony. After all, Grimaldi was a confessed participant in the murder who had cut a deal with prosecutors. Defense lawyers portrayed him as unreliable, someone who would say anything to save himself. Without Sam DeStefano to back up the story without physical evidence, the jury let Spelletro walk. Spelletro went on to become one of the Chicago outfit's most important operatives in Las Vegas. He was sent there to watch the outfit's interests in the casinos to make sure that the skimming operations continued smoothly, to enforce the outfit's will through violence when necessary. Spelletro's life in Vegas was later made into a movie in the movie Casino, where he was played by Joe Pesci. The character Nicky Santoro was based on Spelletro, and while the movie took freedoms with the facts, it caught his basic nature, violent, ambitious, loyal to the outfit, and finally doomed by his own excesses. By the mid-1980s, Spelletro had become a problem in Vegas. His violence was getting too much attention. His affair with the wife of another mobster was causing problems. The outfit leadership decided he had to go. Just as they had decided about DeStefano years earlier on June 14, 1986. Tony Spelletro and his brother Michael were tricked to a meeting in Indiana. They were told it was a ceremony where Tony would be made a capo, promoted to a leadership position in the outfit. It was a lie. The Spelletro brothers were beaten with baseball bats and fists. The beating was long and brutal when they were barely alive. They were buried in a shallow grave in an Indiana cornfield. The bodies were found a week later. Tony Spelletro, who had executed Sam DeStefano, who had taken part in dozens of murders, who had tortured and killed for the Chicago outfit for years, died the same way his victims had died. Beaten, suffering, buried without ceremony. Violence causes violence. The cycle continues. The men who live by the sword die by the sword, or the shotgun, or the baseball bat. The Chicago outfit's history is a story of men killing other men, of betrayal and blood, of temporary power followed by inevitable death. FBI agent William F. Rarmer Jr. spent years investigating organized crime in Chicago. He had seen mob violence in all its forms: shootings, stabbings, bombings, stranglings. He had investigated hundreds of murders. He had talked to countless victims and witnesses. And after all that experience, after all those years, he said that Sam DeStefano was the worst torture murderer in United States history. This was not an overstatement. Reimer was not prone to exaggeration. He was a professional law enforcement agent making a thought-out judgment based on years of experience. In his opinion, no one in American criminal history had mixed cruelty, torture, and murder to the extent that Sandano had. Fano killed dozens of people. The exact count is unknown and probably unknowable. Many of his victims were gotten rid of in ways that made sure they would never be found. Others were found but could not be definitely linked to him. The murders we know about Arty Adler, Leo Foreman, William Action Jackson. These are likely just a part of his total victims. His reign of terror lasted about 30 years. From his release from prison in the mid-1940s until his death in 1973. 3 decades of loan sharking, torture, and murder. 3 decades of corrupting the justice system. 3 decades of working with almost no punishment in one of America's largest cities. DeStefano was never made. Never became a formal member of the Chicago outfit with all the status and protection that came with it. The outfit leadership always thought he was too unstable, too unpredictable, too openly cruel. Made members were supposed to be reliable to follow orders, to work according to certain rules. DeStefano followed no rules but his own, yet, despite never being made. DeStefano gave millions of dollars to the outfit's money over the years. His loan sharking operation was hugely profitable, and he paid a percentage to the outfit as tribute. He was a valuable asset, making income and removing problems through violence. The outfit used him while also keeping him at arm's length, benefiting from his work while keeping believable distance from his methods. Vano changed loan sharking in Chicago before him. Loan sharks were businessmen who used violence as a tool after him. The loan sharking business in Chicago was connected with extreme cruelty and torture. His methods became famous or copied by others, became part of the standard operating procedure for Chicago's juice loan records. But even tough mobsters were disturbed by DeStefano. Testimony from various mob informants over the years constantly showed DeStefano as someone apart. Someone whose violence went beyond what was necessary or acceptable even in the violent world of organized crime. Men who had committed multiple murders themselves were shocked by what DeStefano did to his victims. This discomfort with DeStefano's methods added to his final execution. The outfit did not kill him just because he was getting attention or because he might talk. They killed him because he was an embarrassment. A reminder of the darkest parts of organized crime at a time when the outfit was trying to show a more business-like image. What makes a man like Sam DeStefano? This question has occupied criminologists, psychologists, and historians for years. Understanding DeStefano means understanding how evil develops, how a human being becomes able to such extreme cruelty. The evidence of mental instability appears early in DeStefano's life. His first arrest at age 17 for jailbreak. His arrest at 18 for kidnapping and attempted rape. These are not typical crimes of poverty or chance. They are crimes that suggest a basic disconnect from normal human empathy and social rules. Sexual violence appears as a through line in DeStefano's life. The attempted rape at 18, the rape in nightclub in his adult years, the sexual torture of victims like Action Jackson, the sexual humiliation of Peter Capaldi for DeStefano. Sexuality and violence were mixed in ways that suggest deep psychological problems. The cruelty grew throughout his life. Early crimes were relatively straightforward. Robbery, attack, crimes with clear material reasons. But as DeStefano gained power and wealth, as he no longer needed to commit crimes for money, the violence became more fancy, more theatrical. more focused on suffering rather than profit. The rumors of devil worship, whether literally true or not, speak to how DeStefano understood his own behavior. He saw himself as somehow special, chosen, allowed to break normal moral boundaries. Whether he actually worshipped Satan or simply identified with the archetype, the result was the same. He gave himself permission to commit acts of extreme evil. The separation in DeStefano's life is striking. Upstairs, a family, wife, children. The signs of suburban normalcy. Downstairs, a torture room. These two realities existed in the same physical space, separated only by a floor and soundproofing. His children grew up in that house, played in the backyard, had birthday parties, went to school, lived normal lives. And beneath them, men were being tortured to death. How did his wife Anita cope with this knowledge? She knew what Sam was, what he did. She lived with the constant threat of violence. The Russian roulette games were not occasional odd events. They were a regular occurrence. Yet she stayed, raised the children, kept the household. The psychology of abuse explains some of this. The learned helplessness, the fear, the belief that escape is impossible. But still the mental conflict needed to live that life is almost impossible to understand. The children, by most accounts, did not know the full truth about their father until much later. They knew he was involved in some kind of business, that he associated with rough men, that people feared him. But the specifics of the torture room, the murders, the extent of his cruelty, these were hidden from them. How did they process this knowledge when they finally learned it? What does it do to a person to realize that their father was one of the worst monsters in American criminal history? The nature versus nurture debate applies to DeStefano as it does to all criminals. Was he born with a tendency toward cruelty and violence? The evidence suggests yes. His behavior from a very young age suggests someone basically different from normal people. But was he also shaped by his environment? Again, yes. Growing up in the shadow of the Huron massacre, coming of age in Chicago's gang-controlled Little Italy, being educated in violence by the 42 Gang and the Chicago outfit. Probably the truth is some combination. DeStefano likely had natural psychological traits. Lack of empathy, attraction to violence, cruel urges that in a different environment might have been directed differently or suppressed. But the environment he found himself in not only failed to suppress these traits, but actually rewarded them. Violence was the money of power in his world. Cruelty made him useful to the outfit. His problems found the perfect ecosystem in which to grow. Modern psychological profiling would likely diagnose DeStefano with antisocial personality disorder. Certainly, but also with sadistic personality disorder. A controversial diagnosis that refers to individuals who get pleasure from cruelty. Not just someone willing to commit violence for profit or survival, but someone who actively looks for chances to cause suffering. There is also evidence of possible psychosis. The foaming at the mouth, the incomprehensible ranting, the strange behaviors that went beyond strategic performance. While some of DeStefano's oddness was calculated to create a defense of insanity, some of it seems to have been real breaks with reality. But finally, diagnostic labels can only explain so much. Sam DeStefano was in the end a unique individual whose particular combination of traits, circumstances and choices created a monster. Understanding him does not excuse him, does not make what he did less horrible. It just helps us recognize that evil is not always the product of obvious problems. Sometimes it develops gradually, rewarded by circumstances, unchecked by society, until it becomes something truly terrible. Sam DeStefano's impact on the Chicago outfit was important and lasting. His loan sharking operations made millions of dollars in profit over the years. Money that flowed into the outfit's money and helped pay for other operations. In the purely economic math of organized crime, DeStefano was a valuable asset. His corruption network became part of the outfit's broader corruption network. The judges he bribed, the police officers he paid off, the prosecutors he bought. These relationships were valuable to other outfit members as well. DeStefano's years of systematically corrupting Chicago's justice system created infrastructure that the outfit used for years. The corruption went beyond law enforcement into politics. Chicago in the mid-20th century was famous for political corruption, and the outfit played a major role in that corruption. DeStefano's connections to local politicians, ward bosses and political operatives were part of the web that allowed the outfit to influence elections, control patronage jobs, and work with minimal interference from city government. This corruption influenced Chicago politics for years after DeStefano's death. The relationships he built, the systems he set up, the precedents he set. These did not disappear when he was killed. They continued, changed, adapted. While Chicago has made important steps in reducing corruption since the 1970s, the legacy of that time still affects the city. DeStefano's loan sharking operations continued after his death, run by his surviving associates and finally taken into other outfit operations. But the level of cruelty decreased a lot, without DeStefano's personal problems driving it. Loan sharking returned to being mainly a business rather than an excuse for torture. Violence was still used when necessary, but it was more controlled, more purposeful, less theatrical. This change reflected a broader shift in the Chicago outfit during the 1970s. The old-school gangsters who had come of age during Prohibition were dying off or retiring. A new generation was taking over, and they were more businesslike, more focused on profit than on reputation and fear. They saw Advano's cruelty as a problem, not an asset. His murder marked a turning point in the outfit's change from street gang to criminal corporation. The high-profile nature of some of Advano's crimes, particularly the William Jackson murder, brought unwanted federal attention to the outfit. The FBI increased its resources devoted to investigating Chicago organized crime. Prosecutors became more aggressive. The media attention made it harder for the outfit to work quietly. This attention added to the outfit's final decline. The RICO racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations Act passed in 1970 gave federal prosecutors a powerful new tool for targeting organized crime. Combined with increasingly sophisticated investigative ways, aggressive prosecution, and the willingness of more mobsters to turn informant, our ICO began taking apart the outfit piece by piece. By the 1990s, the Chicago outfit that had been one of America's most powerful criminal organizations was a shadow of its former self. Leadership positions that once commanded respect and fear were held by men running small-time gambling and loan sharking operations. The days of multi-million-dollar casino schemes and political influence were over. DeStefano's murder in 1973 thus represented not just the end of one man's reign of terror, but symbolically the beginning of the end of the outfit's golden age. The organization had tolerated DeStefano for years because he was profitable and useful. But when his behavior threatened the organization's survival, they killed him without hesitation. It was a moment of clarity for the outfit. Survival needed adaptation, discretion, and a lower profile. The age of Mad Sam DeStefano, of open cruelty and theatrical violence was over. What makes a man like Sam DeStefano? We have explored his history, his crimes, his psychology. But the question remains basically mysterious. How does a human being become able to such cruelty? How does someone get pleasure from causing extreme suffering? Part of the answer lies in opportunity. DeStefano lived in a time and place where the systems that should have stopped him, law enforcement, the courts, social rules, were corrupted or ineffective. Chicago in the mid-20th century was a city where organized crime worked openly, where police worked for criminals, where judges could be bought. In a different society with working institutions and effective law enforcement, DeStefano might have been stopped early in his criminal career. His first conviction for attempted rape should have resulted in a long prison sentence. His later crimes should have been investigated and charged. But they were not, and he learned that he could work with no punishment. Part of the answer lies in psychopathy, a clinical lack of empathy. The inability to feel what others feel. The absence of conscience. DeStefano showed classic psychopathic traits from a young age. Impulsivity, aggression, lack of remorse, superficial charm. He could be charming when it served his purposes. And a grandiose sense of self-worth. These traits are not chosen. They are likely rooted in brain structure and development. Psychopaths are made by genetics and early childhood experiences, not by conscious choice. But psychopathy alone does not explain dysfuno. Many psychopaths never commit violent crimes. They might become unethical businessmen, manipulative partners, or difficult co-workers. But they do not build torture rooms in their basement. What distinguished DeStefano was the combination of psychopathy with cruelty. Not just the absence of empathy, but the active getting of pleasure from others' pain. And then there is the social context. DeStefano grew up in a world that valued violence. The Huron massacre showed him that group violence could achieve goals. The Chicago gangster culture showed him that violence could bring wealth and status. The 42 gang taught him that extreme violence made him valuable to powerful men. Every step of his development reinforced the lesson that violence worked, that cruelty was rewarded. The meeting of these factors, opportunity, psychopathy, cruelty, and social context, created Sam DeStefano. Remove any one of these elements and perhaps his life goes differently. But they all came together in one person in one place at one time, and the result was a monster. The victims of Sam DeStefano are mostly forgotten now. Arty Adler, Peter Capoy, William Jackson, Leo Foreman. These names mean nothing to most people. They were men with families, with hopes and dreams, with lives that mattered. They made bad decisions, got involved with the wrong people, borrowed money they could not pay back. They did not deserve what happened to them. No one deserves to be tortured, to suffer for hours or days before being given the kindness of death. Their families were destroyed by DeStefano's actions. Capoletti's family, forced to take part in his humiliation, carried that trauma forever. Jackson's family, learning how their husband and father died, could never unhear those details. Foreman's family, knowing he was tricked to his death by men he thought were friends, lost not just a loved one, but their ability to trust. The generational trauma goes beyond the immediate families. Children who grew up knowing their father or grandfather was tortured to death by Mad Sam DeStefano carry that knowledge. It shapes them, affects them, becomes part of their family story. Trauma echoes through generations, and what of DeStefano's own family? His children who grew up in that house, who lived above the torture room, who later learned what their father was. What has their life been like? They did not choose their father. They did not ask to be born into that family. Yet they carry the burden of his legacy, the shame, the horror, the knowledge that they are the children of one of the worst monsters in American criminal history. Tony Spilotro, who executed DeStefano, was himself finally executed in almost the same way that DeStefano had executed Leo Foreman. Beaten brutally before being killed, the cycle of violence consumed him too. He lived by violence, profited from violence, and finally died by violence. Mario DeStefano, who took part in tortures alongside his brother, who voted for his brother's execution, who was found guilty of murder, died of a heart attack before facing final justice. Did he feel guilt in his final years? Did he regret the things he had done? The people he had hurt, we will never know. He took those answers to his grave. The survivors, Peter Capoy. If he is still alive, the families of the victims, the DeStefano's own children and grandchildren, they all live with the legacy of what Mad Sam did. The trauma does not disappear. It may fade. It may be processed through therapy or religion or time, but it never completely goes away. The story of Sam DeStefano is not just about one man's cruelty. It is about the systems that enabled him. Chicago's corruption in the mid-20th century was so complete, so deeply set that a man could torture and murder with no punishment for 30 years. Police officers, judges, prosecutors, politicians, all were part of the machinery that allowed DeStefano to work. This was not just a few bad apples. This was system-wide, built-in corruption. And while Chicago has made important progress since then, the legacy of that time still affects the city. Trust in institutions once lost is hard to rebuild. People who lived through that time, who saw how completely corrupted their government was, passed that cynicism onto their children and grandchildren. The Chicago outfit's final decline came through federal intervention. Local law enforcement could not or would not stop organized crime. They were too corrupted, too compromised. It took federal agencies with resources an area beyond Chicago's corrupt local system to begin taking apart the outfit. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, was specifically made to target organized crime. It allowed prosecutors to charge all members of a criminal organization for crimes committed by any member in furtherance of the organization. This was revolutionary. Instead of charging individual criminals for individual crimes, prosecutors could now target the entire criminal enterprise. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, federal prosecutors used RICO to systematically take apart the Chicago outfit and other organized crime families. Leaders were found guilty and sentenced to long prison terms. Assets were taken. The organizational structure was disrupted. By the 1990s, the outfit was a fraction of its former strength. But organized crime did not disappear. It changed. Modern Chicago still deals with gang violence, drug trafficking, corruption, and organized criminal activity. The forms have changed. Street gangs rather than traditional mob families. Drug trafficking rather than gambling and loan sharking. More broken up and less ranked organizations. But the underlying problems remain. Violence continues in different forms. Chicago regularly ranks among America's most violent cities, with hundreds of murders per year. While these murders are mostly gang-related rather than mob-related, the impact on communities is the same. Families destroyed, trauma continued, cycles of violence continuing. The lessons from the Sam DeStefano time have not been fully learned. We still have systems that fail to protect weak people. We still have corruption, though hopefully less common than in DeStefano's time. We still have violence continued by those who believe they can act with no punishment. Sam DeStefano is buried at Queen of Heaven Catholic Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in Section 20, near the meeting of Sections 14 and 22. It is a Catholic cemetery, which is almost darkly funny. This man, who allegedly worshipped the devil, who tortured and murdered dozens of people, who lived a life of pure evil, is buried in holy ground. His grave is not special. There is no fancy monument, no sign that anyone particularly important or famous is buried there. Just another grave among thousands, slowly being forgotten as the years pass and the people who remember Mad Sam die off. He died at 63 years old, younger than many men, but having lived a full life by any measure. He had been rich, feared, powerful. He had enjoyed every dark urge, committed every crime he desired. He had lived exactly as he wanted, with no apparent remorse or regret. And in the end, he died quickly, far more mercifully than any death he had caused on his victims. There is no justice in that, really. Sam DeStefano deserved to suffer for what he did. He deserved to experience the same terror and pain he caused on others. But life is not fair, death is not just, and sometimes monsters die peacefully. The house at 1656 North S Avenue was finally destroyed. The torture room in the basement was destroyed. Though one imagines the demolition crew must have felt some unease tearing it down. The screams that echoed in that space for 20 years are finally truly silenced. A new house sits on that lot now, and its residents probably do not know or choose not to know the history of the ground under them, but the story remains. The legend of Mad Sam DeStefano lives on in books, in FBI files, in the memories of elderly Chicagoans who remember the headlines, in the stories passed down through families of the victims. The story remains as a warning tale, a warning, a reminder. A warning tale about what happens when systems fail, when corruption goes unchecked, when evil finds fertile ground to grow. Sam DeStefano was a monster, yes, but he was a monster that society created. A different society with different values and different institutions would not have allowed him to grow for 30 years. A warning about the commonness of evil. DeStefano was not some special demon or supernatural threat. He was a man. A human being with a childhood and a family and a house in the suburbs. Evil does not always announce itself with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes it lives next door, raises children, goes to work every day. Sometimes evil looks disturbingly normal, a reminder that we are all capable of becoming part of evil. The police officers who took bribes, the judges who fixed cases, the neighbors who suspected but said nothing, the associates who saw torture and took part or watched. These were all normal people who made choices to enable evil. It is easy to think we would be different, that we would stand up and resist, but history suggests otherwise. Most people in the right circumstances will go along with evil rather than resist it at personal cost. The story of Sam DeStefano is finally a story about us, about human nature, about the choices we make, about the societies we build and the monsters we allow to exist within them. It is about the darkest abilities of human beings and the systems that either limit or enable those abilities. We want to believe that people like Sam DeStefano are rare oddities so far outside the normal range of human behavior that we need never worry about meeting them. But the truth is more disturbing, given the right combination of factors. Psychological traits, social environment, enabling systems, lack of results. More people are able to extreme evil than we would like to admit. The lesson is not that we are all potential Sam DeStefanos. Most of us are not. But the lesson is that creating a society where Sam DeStefanos can work needs the participation or acceptance of thousands of ordinary people. The police officers, the judges, the politicians, the neighbors, the associates, all made choices that allowed him to continue. All decided consciously or unconsciously that stopping him was not worth the personal cost. And that is the lesson we need to carry forward. Evil wins not just because evil people do evil things, but because good people, or at least normal people, fail to stop them. Systems become corrupt not through some inevitable process, but through thousands of individual choices to look the other way, to accept a bribe, to ignore injustice. Sam DeStefano is dead, killed by his own organization in a garage in 1973. But the systems that enabled him, the corruption, the violence, the failure of institutions, these did not die with him. They changed, adapted, continue in different forms. The fight against them continues. This story is not just history, it is a mirror showing us what we are capable of. Both the darkest evil and the enabling of that evil through inaction. If we learn nothing else from the story of Mad Sam DeStefano, we should learn that evil needs more than just evil people. It needs ordinary people making ordinary compromises, accepting ordinary corruption, turning a blind eye to extraordinary cruelty. The screams from the basement at 1656 North S Avenue have been silenced for 50 years. But if we do not learn from this history, if we do not recognize the warning signs, if we do not build and keep the systems and values that prevent monsters like Sam DeStefano from growing, then somewhere somehow those screams will echo again in the end. The story of Mad Sam DeStefano is a warning from history written in blood and suffering. Heed it, so there you have it, the complete unvarnished story of Mad Sam DeStefano. The man the FBI called the worst torture murderer in American history. A man so violent, so unstable that even the Chicago outfit, an organization built on violence, had to remove him. If this story kept you riveted, if you stayed until the end, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells me you want more deep dive gangster stories like this. Subscribe and turn on that notification bell because I have got an entire library of untold mob stories coming your way. From the 5 families of New York to the Kansas City mob. From the Philadelphia Underworld to the Detroit Partnership. We are going deep into the shadows of American organized crime. Drop a comment below. What shocked you most about Mad Sam's story? Was it the soundproof room? The victim was forced to be humiliated in front of family. The fact that he wore pajamas to court. Or maybe the betrayal by his own brother. I read every single comment, and your feedback shapes what stories I tell next. And here is a question for the true crime community. Who was worse, Sam DeStefano or his protege, Tony Spallatro? Let me know in the comments. Share this video with someone who loves true crime. Send it to your friend who is always asking about mob history. Post it in your true crime groups. This is the kind of story that needs to be told. Not glorified, but understood. Remember, the darkest chapters of history teach us the most important lessons. Understanding monsters like Sam DeStefano helps us recognize evil when we see it today. Thanks for listening to The Bitter End. Stay safe out there, and remember, in the world of organized crime, loyalty is rare. Betrayal is common, and violence is always just one wrong move away. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.